He was Hollywood's ultimate tough guy, gritty, cold, and unforgettable. But behind Lee Marvin's steely glare was a man shaped by war, scandal, heartbreak, and secrets the public never saw. From battlefield hero to Oscar winner to courtroom chaos, this is the untold story of a legend who never played by the rules. Let's dig into his origins first.
Look, you little bastard, either you march, or I'll beat your brains out. Understand?
Before the world knew him as a cold-blooded killer on screen, Lee Marvin was just a chaotic, misunderstood kid bouncing between classrooms and hunting grounds. Born on February 24, 1924, in New York City, Lee was the son of Lamont Marvin, a strict World War I veteran, and Courtney Marvin, a fashion designer with high expectations. The contrast between military discipline and artistic refinement ran straight through their youngest son, but neither side seemed to stick. From a young age, Marvin couldn't sit still. He was restless, sharp-tongued, and constantly drifting into trouble. What teachers saw as disobedience was actually something deeper. He struggled with undiagnosed ADHD and dyslexia, which made school a nightmare and left him feeling like a failure before he even had a chance. While other kids his age were learning manners and multiplication, Lee was learning how to track prey in the swampy underbelly of the Everglades. He'd spend entire weekends alone in the wild, hunting deer, turkeys, and bobwhite quail. Not for sport, but for solitude. It was the one place where he didn't have to answer to anyone, where silence, aim, and instinct mattered more than reading or arithmetic. And in a twisted way, it was preparing him for the violent roles and violent real-life experiences still to come. Lee was eventually enrolled at a socialist boarding school called Manumit, and then sent off to military academies in an effort to shape him up. It didn't work. He was expelled more than once, caught up in smoking, brawling, and pushing back against every authority figure in his path. It's no wonder Hollywood would one day cast him as the rebel, the villain, the unpredictable force you couldn't quite control. Even as a teenager, Lee Marvin wasn't just acting tough, he was living it. But the real transformation wouldn't happen until a bullet nearly tore through his spine. By the time Lee Marvin turned 18, his reputation as a troublemaker was solid. School had failed him, and he had no clear future in sight, just a trail of suspensions, unfinished courses, and a burning restlessness no one could tame. But when World War II broke out, everything changed. On August 2, 1942, Marvin enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, a decision that shocked even his battle-hardened father, who had served in World War I. The chief, as Lee called him, didn't believe his rebellious son could survive the brutality of war. But Lee didn't enlist to prove anyone wrong. He did it because, deep down, chaos was the only thing that made sense to him. The Marines didn't cure Lee of his wildness. They sharpened it into something far more dangerous. He was trained as a scout sniper in the 4th Marine Division and sent straight into the heart of the Pacific Theater. There, he experienced the kind of horror that most actors only pretend to know. He fought in the invasions of Eniwetok and Saipan, two of the most gruesome battles of the war. It was in Saipan where Marvin's luck nearly ran out. On June 18, 1944, during the assault on Mount Tapachau, he was struck by machine gun fire that tore through his sciatic nerve. As if that wasn't enough, a sniper's bullet hit his foot shortly after. He was one of only a handful of men in his unit who survived. Marvin spent over a year recovering from his injuries and was eventually discharged with full honors. He was awarded the Purple Heart, the Presidential Unit Citation, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and more. But the scars went deeper than medals. Marvin would later say, "The Marines taught me how to act." After that, pretending to be rough wasn't hard. And he meant it. Because once you've seen real death up close, the kind Hollywood sells on camera starts to feel like a cheap imitation. Lee Marvin didn't act tough. He lived through hell and brought the smoke with him. When Lee Marvin came home from the war, he wasn't a hero looking for glory. He was a broken man trying to find something that made sense. His body still ached from the gunfire that nearly ended his life. His mind was rattled from the memories he couldn't outrun. He wasn't thinking about stardom. In fact, all he wanted was a job. So, like many veterans, he picked up a trade and started working as a plumber's assistant in Woodstock, New York. It was a quiet, thankless job, but it kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. Then one day, fate stepped in. While fixing pipes at a local theater, Marvin was pulled in to fill a role last minute after an actor fell sick during rehearsal. It was meant to be a one-off, just someone to read lines and keep the show moving. But something clicked. Standing under the spotlight, Marvin felt a jolt of adrenaline he hadn't felt since the war. It wasn't just acting. It was control, purpose, intensity. The same instincts that helped him survive on the battlefield were suddenly being channeled into a stage performance. And he couldn't get enough of it. With the help of the GI Bill, Marvin enrolled in acting classes at the American Theater Wing in New York City. He was determined to learn the craft properly, not just rely on his grit. He moved to Greenwich Village, soaked up the bohemian culture, and took whatever gigs he could find, even the ones that didn't pay. For a while, he was just another face in the crowd, grinding out small parts and living off scraps. But even in those early roles, people noticed something about him. An intensity, a quiet rage, a presence you couldn't teach. By 1949, Marvin was already performing on stage and in small film roles. Nothing huge. Nothing glamorous. But the spark had caught. He wasn't just playing characters. He was channeling the ghosts of war, of his youth, of the violence he'd seen. Hollywood didn't know it yet, but a new kind of actor had just walked in through the back door. And he wasn't smiling for the camera. As the 1950s rolled in, Lee Marvin's acting career began to gain momentum, but with every new role, a pattern started to form. Casting directors didn't see a classically trained performer or a rising theater star. They saw the haunted eyes of a man who'd been to war. They saw the hard jaw, the scarred stare, the gravel in his voice. And so they kept handing him uniforms, weapons, and badges. Whether it was a cop, a soldier, a thug, or a hitman, Marvin kept getting cast as the enforcer, the brute, the cold-blooded guy who'd do whatever had to be done. And the truth? He didn't mind it, at least, not at first. His real-life military experience gave him an edge other actors couldn't fake. He'd often help directors stage fight scenes, advise on tactical movements, or correct how actors held their weapons. On the set of Teresa in 1951, Marvin quietly coached the crew on infantry realism, giving the film a sense of authenticity that no studio training could replicate. He wasn't just playing a role, he was reliving it, frame by frame. But there was a downside. His characters were usually one note, aggressive, violent, and emotionally sealed shut. It was like Hollywood had decided who he was, and no amount of range could change their minds. He did a string of forgettable roles in mid-tier war dramas and B-level westerns, Hangman's Knot, The Glory Brigade, Seminole. He showed up in anthology series like Fireside Theater and Rebound, always playing the same variation of a hard man with a gun. His breakthrough role in The Big Heat, 1953, finally gave him something to sink his teeth into, a sadistic villain who pours scalding coffee on a woman's face. It was vicious, chilling, and impossible to forget. And just like that, Lee Marvin stopped being a background player. He became the guy you cast when you wanted someone who looked like he could actually kill you. The wild kid from the Everglades had finally arrived. But even bigger roles, and even stranger turns, were right around the corner. By the mid-1960s, Lee Marvin had carved out a steady niche in Hollywood. He wasn't a leading man in the traditional sense, too rough around the edges, too raw, but he was dependable, magnetic, and believable. Audiences knew what to expect when his name appeared in the credits. Grit, violence, and very little emotion. But that image shattered in 1965, when Marvin took a role that flipped his entire persona on its head, and earned him the biggest award of his career. The film was Cat Ballou, a comedic western with Jane Fonda in the lead and Marvin playing not one, but two roles, the drunken, washed-up gunslinger Kid Shalene and his cold, ruthless twin brother, Tim Strawn. It was a risky move. Marvin wasn't known for comedy, and portraying two completely opposite characters, one a stumbling, slapstick mess and the other a stoic assassin, seemed like a gamble that could have destroyed his career if it failed. But instead, it became a revelation. As Kid Shalene, Marvin gave a performance no one saw coming. He was pathetic and lovable, constantly slurring his words and fumbling with his holster, pants barely hanging on, reeking of alcohol and regret. Then, as Strawn, he transformed into the grim, nose-less killer with dead eyes and ice in his veins. The contrast was so sharp it stunned critics and viewers alike. It was as if Marvin was battling himself on screen, and somehow winning both fights. Audiences couldn't stop talking about it. Critics called it the performance of a lifetime. And when Oscar night arrived, Lee Marvin took home the Academy Award for Best Actor. But instead of delivering a grand, heartfelt speech, he stepped up to the microphone and gave credit where he believed it was truly due. "I think half of this belongs to a horse somewhere out in the valley," he joked. The crowd roared. But beneath the humor was something real. Marvin wasn't the type to bask in praise. He saw Hollywood for what it was, a circus. And in that moment, he reminded everyone that even in the glitzy world of awards, he still didn't take himself too seriously. Winning an Oscar changes most actors. It inflates egos, opens floodgates of fame, and invites a parade of yes men. But Lee Marvin wasn't most actors. The gold statue gave him leverage, sure, but not happiness. What it did give him was control, and for a while, he used it wisely. In the years following Cat Ballou, Marvin carefully chose roles that pushed boundaries, told darker stories, and gave him space to stretch beyond the tough guy stereotype. He wasn't just the muscle anymore. He was the man pulling strings behind the scenes. In The Professionals, 1966, he delivered another knockout performance, but it was Point Blank in 1967 that truly cemented his post-Oscar evolution. As a vengeful ex-con named Walker, Marvin became the face of cold-blooded retribution in a film that was years ahead of its time. Stylish, violent, and eerily detached. Critics praised the film's gritty realism, and Marvin had a hand in shaping it from the inside out, reportedly influencing the script and the direction under John Berman. This wasn't just acting. It was authorship. But the more power he gained, the less interested he seemed in playing the game. Marvin never liked Hollywood parties, didn't charm journalists, and refused to fake politeness on set. He was blunt, gruff, and increasingly reclusive. And as the 1970s crept in, so did a slow decline. The roles became less iconic, the films less memorable. Projects like Hell in the Pacific, Prime Cut, and Emperor of the North had moments of brilliance, but they couldn't recapture the magic of his earlier years. Behind the scenes, the cracks were showing. Marvin was drinking more, smiling less, and drifting from the spotlight. He didn't care about fame. He never really had. And the more the industry tried to reshape itself, the more Marvin seemed like a relic from a grittier, more honest time. He didn't adapt. He didn't want to. And in Hollywood, refusing to play along is the fastest way to disappear. Off-camera, Lee Marvin was as unpredictable as any character he played. While he was fiercely private, his love life turned into one of Hollywood's messiest public scandals, and it wasn't because of a marriage gone bad. It was because of the one that never happened. Marvin married his first wife, Betty Ebeling, in 1952. They were together for 15 years, raised 4 children, and for a while, seemed like a grounded family despite his rising fame. But things weren't picture perfect. Marvin was restless, often away for work, and carrying the burden of a war he never truly left behind. They separated, reconciled, and finally divorced in 1967. That's when Michelle Triola entered the picture. Triola was an aspiring actress who became Marvin's live-in partner for 6 years. Though they never married, she legally changed her last name to Marvin and behaved, publicly and privately, like a wife. After the relationship ended, Triola didn't walk away quietly. Instead, she sued Marvin in a case that would become one of the most infamous legal battles in Hollywood history. Marvin versus Marvin, also known as the Palimony case. She claimed Marvin had promised to support her financially even without marriage, that he paid for her abortions, that she'd suffered miscarriages, and that she could no longer have children because of the relationship. Triola wanted nearly half of Marvin's earnings from the years they lived together, about $1.8 million at the time. The case turned ugly fast. Reporters circled, the public weighed in, and suddenly Marvin's personal life was headline material. In the end, Triola was awarded $104,000 for rehabilitation, but the court threw out her claim for Marvin's earnings. Years later, the award itself was reversed when the court ruled there was no contract, verbal or written, between them. The case became a cautionary tale in celebrity relationships, and it left Marvin deeply shaken. He never spoke much about it afterward. Eventually, he found peace with his second wife, Pamela Fee, whom he married in 1970. They stayed together until the end. But by then, the damage had been done. Marvin had seen how fame could turn love into lawsuits and privacy into a public circus. By the 1980s, the fire that once fueled Lee Marvin's career had dimmed. He was no longer the box office force he'd once been, and while the roles kept coming, they lacked the bite of his earlier work. Films like Death Hunt, Gorky Park, and Dog Day showed flashes of the old Marvin, but audiences had moved on. The gritty anti-heroes he helped define had been replaced by flashier, younger stars. Marvin never tried to compete. He wasn't interested in reinvention. He was who he was, brutal, honest, and unapologetically himself. But behind the stoic exterior, his body was failing. Years of heavy drinking, chain-smoking, and the physical toll of war had caught up to him. In late 1986, Marvin was hospitalized with complications related to coccidioidomycosis, a fungal infection in the lungs. He spent over 2 weeks fighting it off, only to return months later with even more severe issues. In August 1987, he was rushed to a hospital after suffering a ruptured intestine and respiratory distress. Doctors administered steroids to help him breathe, but instead, they triggered a fatal heart attack. On August 29, 1987, Lee Marvin died at the age of 63. But even in death, Marvin left behind one final act of rebellion. When he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, a place reserved for true American heroes, his tombstone said nothing about his acting career. No mention of the Oscar. No tribute to Hollywood. Just 5 simple words: Lee Marvin, PFC, U.S. Marine Corps. He'd once said that fame was fleeting and meaningless. That in Hollywood, they'll give you a star on the sidewalk and then let a dog take a dump on it. He wasn't bitter, just realistic. Marvin knew what mattered in the end. Not the roles, not the scandals, but the fact that he served, survived, and stayed true to himself in a town that demanded conformity. And there you have it. Lee Marvin's story. Lee Marvin didn't chase fame, he endured it. He walked through Hollywood with a soldier's scars, a rebel's attitude, and a total disregard for what others expected of him. He wasn't there to charm, please, or play the game. He brought real-life grit to every role because he lived it long before the cameras rolled. From surviving one of the bloodiest battles of World War II to becoming the face of American masculinity on screen, Marvin's story was never polished. It was raw, flawed, and unforgettable. And in the end, he made it clear what truly mattered to him. Not the lights, not the legacy, not even the Oscar. Just the uniform he wore when he faced real danger. Hollywood lost one of its toughest stars in 1987, but the man beneath the glare left behind something far more powerful than fame. He left behind truth. And that never fades.